It's ridiculous to talk about China as one country. So China is 4 countries. The cities of Shanghai, Beijing, Tianjin, Shenzhen belong to the first world in the sense that their income is as high as first world countries. In the United Nations Human Development Index, if Shanghai were an independent country, it'd be number 32 in the world. In the second world, we find Guangdong, Jiangnan, Zhejiang, and Jiangsu, which would be ranked about 70 if they were independent countries. Then we have the third world, to the central and western regions, which would be among the first 100 countries. And we have a fourth world in China, which would be ranked near the bottom of the list. Now, if we look at the population, 50% of the population of China is living in circumstances corresponding to the fourth countries as well. 26% is in the first 100, and it's only 4.4% that were in the first and second world. This is the challenge that China has in trying to modernize. If California were an independent country, it's ranked 7th in the world. But it's not treated as an independent country, it's part of the United States. I think we should be talking about regions rather. We should compare the European Union to China, compare the United States in terms of size. But a country like Japan, with 130 million people, is 1/10 of the population of China. Less than 1,000 million people, 15% of the world population, share 72% of the world's GDP. These two countries, 35% share 10 to 12%. That's what is changing, or we expect to change. I'm going to close with a reference to the kind of terminology that's being used in political debate in China today. First phrase, refers to peace and development. Peace is necessary for development. The first item of the Chinese planning is that there will not be a world war in the next 30 years. That's the first step. If there's a world war, everything changes. But they don't expect a world war, at least in the next 30 years. But again, talk about their rise, their economic growth as a peaceful rise, in order to try and put down fears that their emergence as a superpower will be a threat. So their answer to the idea that China's emergence is a threat is a peaceful rise. But even the word rise implies some kind of power. So they changed it to peaceful development. And now they talk about creating a harmonious society. It's a constant phrase for the party in China. But they've also begun talking about a harmonious world. And Tiziana is going to talk about Xiandai, Confucius. So I'll say more about that. One of the keys to China's way of modernizing is this phrase. It means crossing the river by feeling for stillness. You don't go straight across the river. You have to find a place to put your foot. And then you don't take another step until you find a place to put your foot. That is why the Washington Consensus will never be used in China. And that is why Chinese economic planning can switch rapidly and radically from one side to another. Because they are testing things. If they work, they continue. If they don't work, they try something else. Now, that is totally heterodox. When some people have talked about the 20th century, 21st century wars as ideology wars, an analogy of religious wars in the past. But the idea that there are laws of economics that everybody must follow is part of Western Enlightenment thinking. Chinese thinking is absolutely very radical, relative to the circumstances. That's always necessary to adapt to the circumstances. And therefore, they can combine many different systems in the same way that a person in China can be Confucian, a Buddhist, and a Taoist without any contradiction. But for us, it's unimaginable that a person can be a Jewish, Christian, and Muslim at the same time. Not possible. So there's a difference between a kind of orthodoxy, which is the heart of our concept of modernity, and adaptability, or flexibility, which is at their concept of not modernity, because they're traditional concepts. Now, what comes after modernity? in China since the 1990s, intellectuals have been debating a great deal about post-colonialism and post-modernism, both of which question the validity of modernity. Because it was the Enlightenment modernity that was used to justify colonizing the rest of the world, by bringing light to the darkness, by bringing the true faith to the pagans, by bringing capitalism to underdeveloped countries. So postmodernism questions modernism itself. Postmodernity questions the validity of modernity, in fact says it was wrong, it was a mistake. It's very useful for certain intellectuals, especially in the party, to say, well, if the Westerners themselves are not questioning modernity, why should we do it? Why don't we just leap over it? Another great leap forward. We'll leap into postmodernity rather than go through modernity. Post-colonialism also is highly critical of modernity because the policies of laissez-faire did not defend the rights of man in the colonies. This has become so popular in intellectual circles in China that they now refer to it as post-studies, studies of post-colonialism, postmodernism, etc. And there are people who even speak of the Beijing consensus, Joshua Huber published an essay called The Beijing Consensus. Unlike the Washington Consensus, the Beijing Consensus has no rules. The Washington Consensus is a series of rules. The Beijing Consensus is simply not the Washington Consensus in the sense that it's crossing the river by feeling for stones. And the economic development is unquestionable. And the fact that China is coming out of this current crisis of capitalism, or capitalism, fairly well, show that on the area of economic development, they seem to be doing things well. But then there's the question of political development. And the term fragmented authoritarianism is used by an American named Kenneth Lieberthal to describe what's happening in China. Others call it consultative authoritarianism. And the people inside the think tanks of the Central Committee call it incremental democracy. The reason why there's no movement for a quick kind of transformation into Western-style democracy, the style that was imposed in Iraq and in Afghanistan, what the political scientists in China call formal democracy. Formalized constitution, elections, political parties, etc. But in Japan, it produced the same result for 50 years, and Mexico produced the same result for 70 years, etc. And in Afghanistan and Iran, it has had no result whatsoever. They talk about substantive democracy, which would give the people themselves a chance to influence what the party does. Ironically, Mao Zedong is the most democratic leader in Chinese history, in the sense that he recognized that the bureaucracy was the new upper class, and therefore he tried to destroy the bureaucracy by giving people the chance to fight against the bureaucracy. And that resulted in a disaster. And finally, we could say whether or not, instead of modernity coming from China, the Chinese resolution of the crisis of modernity is Confucianism. East Asian capitalism is now being described regularly as Confucian capitalism, as opposed to the Protestant capitalism described by Max Weber. And now, Chinese economists talk about a Confucian world order, in which they practice win-win diplomacy, that there's no conflict because they never talk about the things that are conflicting. I'm going to stop there.